Senator Cotton.
General Friedrichs, I'd like to continue with the answer you just gave to Senator Shaheen about our dependence on other countries for drugs and precursors, specifically communist China. The United States relies heavily on communist China for basic drugs and so-called APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients. Providers obviously need this not just in the civilian world, but in the military world, especially to treat combat casualties. China, for instance, has 80% of the global supply chain of antibiotics. How could communist China use this dependence of ours to its advantage if there were a major conflict in the Pacific?
Thank you very much, Senator Cotton. And I think we've seen examples of this with rare minerals and other things that China largely controls the supply chain for, in that they will choose to titrate that supply chain based on their satisfaction or dissatisfaction with those trying to purchase those items. I had the great privilege in my last role of working with India, the EU, Japan, and Korea on a consortium in which we began to identify ways to leverage new technologies to change and to broaden our supply chains. And I encourage this committee to direct the Department of Defense, in partnership with the Department of Health and Human Services, to continue exploring those options. What we found was, in many cases, as in the case of antibiotics that are based on penicillin, the Japanese have already made a tremendous investment in the ability to produce those APIs within Japan. We should be partnering with them and creating an environment in which at least the DoD and the VA purchase from Japan to help sustain that production base and ensure that we have the access that we need. There are many more examples. I touched on some of them in my written statement, but there are ways to mitigate this.
And your answer to Senator Shaheen said that Congress should push the Department of Defense to catalog all of these dependencies. It sounds like you're saying that we also need to push to eliminate or at least significantly curtail these dependencies as well. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And you mentioned 4 different sourcing options, South Korea, Japan, the EU, and India. Those first 3 are advanced industrial democracies just like ours. If they can produce these items like acetaminophen or ibuprofen or penicillin at a reasonable cost, surely the United States could do so as well, right?
I believe that is the case, and what we found is that, particularly in these countries, they've created an environment in which it was financially possible for companies to produce these items within their country. We have not done that here in the United States, but a thoughtful industrial policy that was focused on resilience and national security, as well as economic security and health security, could do that for us as well.
It's fair to say that between the 2 of them, the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs sure does have a lot of purchasing power to create a domestic market for the production of these fairly basic and long-standing medicines, right?
Absolutely. About 8% of the market, and it gets back to Senator Shaheen's point about continuing resolutions and predictability. If companies know that they have a predictable demand signal, they'll build to it. If they have an episodic or random demand signal, they'll let somebody else deal with that.
General Robb, I've noticed you nodding your head vigorously, so please get off your chest everything you wanted to add to General Friedrichs' answers.
Yes, I also, and I know, I'm sure you're aware, and this has been in the direction from questions asked by our Congress. The Center for Health Services Research at the Uniformed Services University has been tasked with, along with the Defense Logistics Agency, to catalog and specifically look at what and define the problem. What is the Department of Defense's reliance on the medicines that we have talked about that are primarily sourced from China and from India, and then which would then help what I would call inform the decisions way ahead of whether you, what I call it, ally shore, or near shore or onshore, as Dr. Friedrich discussed in looking at a way forward. But they are creating that, what's the data to drive the decision and the investment. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your answers. It's long been the case that the Department of Defense, acting at congressional direction, has mandated the domestic purchase of many uniform items. So I think surely we should make sure that our troops have the medicines they need to stay healthy or to recover as needed.
Thank you, Senator Cotton.